interviewing. You know, that's what they doing. Stick around. It's about to get all Ruby up in here. Remote Ruby starts now.
What's up, Andrew?
What's good, Chris? How's it going?
Oh, you know, late night trip to the ER is good, uneventful as far as that goes, which is good.
Every time I'm around you or Jason, I feel like, yeah, I could be called on to go to the ER this time.
Yeah, it seems like the closer you get, we're like a month out from having our second son. Like, you tend to make trips anytime things are feeling pretty off or whatever. Like, normally you might just be like, okay, whatever, I'll see how this goes for an hour or something. But instead, we're like, yep, screw it. Let's just go to the hospital. We're going to hit our like insurance out of pocket maximum no matter what. So
yeah.
Why not, right? So anyways, today we have another second time special guest here, José Valim. Welcome back. It's been a while.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it has been. Do you remember when it was the last time?
Oh, I'd have to look it up. It was May 6th, 2022.
Yeah.
3.5 years or so. Maybe not quite 3.5.
Probably to talk about Elixir.
Yeah, we talked about live view, talked about you being a Rails core team member and stuff.
Yeah.
Authentication. I know that was Jason's thing for sure. But yeah, I remember that was a long podcast. And then I think we like stopped recording and then talked for like another hour or two afterwards. And we're like, we should have been recording this whole thing.
Let's not stop recording, right?
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So you, since then, have been up to some new stuff, particularly this new Tidewave project, which that's the main thing. But is there anything else that's been exciting that you've been doing since we last talked?
So I think something that was very nice since we last talked is that I went back to Eruco last year. After 8 years, I was invited to be a speaker. And I always say that Eruco is one of my favorite conferences because having a different set of people every year taking on the challenge of organizing the conference in their city and has been running for so long is really special. So it was great to go back there, see Matt, Dave Thomas, reconnect to old friends. Yeah, I think that was pretty nice. But in terms of projects, I think the one that people here would like to hear about is definitely Tidewave.
I have Eruco as one of those conferences I want to get to one of these days, but I haven't been able to make it out yet. So hopefully soon. But Tidewave was making a splash, pun intended, yesterday on Hacker News I saw. So give us an overview of what it is and how it works or whatever.
If you go to the website, it's going to say Tidewave is a coding agent that runs in the browser alongside your web application and is deeply integrated with your web framework from the database to the UI. And we support right now Phoenix and Rails. So it has been nice to come back and do a little bit of Rails and a little bit of Ruby after probably a decade. And I'll tell, before we go into more discussions and expand this, let me just tell a little bit like why Tidewave, why does it matter? You know, you probably have a coding agent in your editor. Maybe you're using Cloud Code or something in your CLI. So what is going to be the difference with Tidewave? So Tidewave runs in your browser, and that's the main difference. So imagine you're using your editor to implement a feature. You're going to use your editor. And imagine that this feature is like you have a view somewhere, a project manager, and then you're like, oh, you have the tasks and you want to export those tasks as a CSV or Excel, whatever. So when you're going to implement it, you usually you open up your application in the browser, you kind of see, oh, there's this drop down here where you can add a button. And then you have to go to the editor and tell it like, hey, on this page, you usually open the file and say, around here, there's a drop down, add a new button here, right? So you're kind of translating what you saw in the browser, right, to your editor. You could be risky and not say anything and just say, hey, on that page, I wanted to add something to the drop down. But with the LLMs, the more precise you can be, it's more likely that it's going to deliver what you actually want to give as much information as you can. So that's what you would do. You'd say, hey, around this page, on this file, in this drop down, you would have to type all these or select in the editor. And then the LLM is going to go implement the feature. And it's going to say, all right, I've implemented it. Then you go back to the browser, you refresh the page, and boom, exception page, right? There is a bug. And then you're like, you go and you copy the stack trace, you copy the exception page from the browser to the editor. It's like, hey, I fixed it, right? And then it runs again, and it's like, oh, the one I see a lot is that it forgets to write the migrations and to run them. So you have to tell them, oh, you have to do all those things. So what has happened is that we are kind of babysitting the AI all the time. We are like doing this translation job because we are working in two places. We're working on the browser, we're working on the editor, and then we have to be passing the information around. With Tidewave, this is how it's going to look like. Tidewave is running the browser, so we click the inspector button, and then you select in the page. So the way Tidewave looks like is that it's running the browser, and then on the left side, there's the chat, and on the right side is literally your web app, right? So you can click the inspector, you select the dropdown, and you say, hey, I here add a CSV export button. And because we deeply integrate with each web framework, we know the templates that were used, we know the controllers that were used to render that page. So we are going to send that information. We not only send like the HTML element that is selected, we say, look, it came from this template. So we send this information to the LLM, and it allows the LLM to be precise, as I was talking about, without us having to be the one feeding this information all the time. And then because it's running in the browser, when it's done implementing the feature, it starts controlling the browser, starts controlling your web app. It's like, okay, let me refresh the page. Let me open up the dropdown. Let me select the new item that I added in the dropdown to see if it works. And then if it finds any exception while doing this validation, it knows that it found an exception and it automatically fixes it. So the end result is that you spend way less time like giving directions, being the middleman between what you see in the browser and what the agent's doing. So the agent can be more agentic, right? Can be more precise and do more things on its own. So that's pretty much Tidewave and what it does and why I think it matters, why it makes a difference to my day-to-day.
When I watched the demo video, I was like, this is awesome because of the context that you have. I mean, this is kind of your flow anyways, where you're like, go change some files like the controller and the views and whatever. And then I go back to the browser and I refresh and like check and see if I did it right. It kind of removes several steps of you're jumping between the editor and different files. You're staying in one place and focusing on that feature right there. And it has so much context there. One of the things I was going to ask you related to this was, have you used the Rails LSP at all?
I have not used, but I was investigating it as part of building Tidewave and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that's been really cool, because Rails or Ruby in general has always had not the best tooling. And it's been cool to see stuff like this where it's like, well, why don't we just run it in your application, and have direct access to the actual running code instead of trying to do like static analysis on things. And that ends up being a lot more guessing than actually knowing that like, yes, this model dynamically defined these methods that we couldn't actually analyze very easily. But when it's running, our editor can just ask, what are the methods available or whatever. So the like Rails LSP has been awesome to give VS Code context where like, yes, this model has these columns or whatever. And I feel like this is another layer on top of that where it's also running right next to your Rails app. So you have access to all of the models and the attributes and validations and whatever else is in there. And you can just ask it things about what's going on. which is like huge because you're not just kind of like, I read this template and I think we can do this and try to generate code and guess a bit more, where you like actually know if that's going to be valid or not with that running live with the server there.
And that's exactly how Tidewave started. So what we launched now is what we call Tidewave Web, because it's running in the web, in the browser, as we were talking about with your UI. But we also have exactly this component as well, that it's running inside Rails. Because like you see a lot of people talking about, oh, we need a way to get to access documentation. So I'm going to add this MCP to access the documentation. But I'm like, what are you talking about? The code and the documentation is on your machine right now, right? Like you have the gem installed. You can go and fetch that documentation and use. And the benefit is that it is going to work with any gem that you have installed and is going to be precise, like it's exactly to the version that you're using. And the same for everything. Oh, especially with Ruby, where you can do a lot of meta programming, right? It's like, well, where was this class or this method defined? And yeah, you can just ask the runtime. Ruby, the runtime, like has the answer to all those things. And that's how we started Tidewave. And we have those things as well. But one of the things that related to that, one of the things that we found interesting as we were playing with this was, for example, take the Rails router file. And we do have like introspection where you can tell, hey, Rails, give us all of your routes. And then you can print them. So one of the things that we found interesting is that giving that to the AI, it's not necessarily helpful. Or giving like, oh, my model validations. And it can be helpful in certain ways. But if you want a coding agent, it's usually better if it wants to know the routes, have it read the routes file. If it wants to know the associations in a model, have it read the beginning of the model, like the first 50 lines. And because that already gives it helps it like start building the mental model to do the edits in the future. While if you are just using reflection, sometimes it knows that the thing exists, so it's going to be good for like debugging and fixing an exception, but it's not necessarily going to be good for writing the code, because the reflection does not necessarily tell it where things are defined and how, if you're using concerns and how you're organizing things internally. And when it's doing the code, it's better equipped to change the code. But the idea is the same. Giving access to the runtime, you also need the source code. But giving access to the runtime is really the magic ingredient, right? Like that's what makes everything work way better.
What happens when a developer decides to record his own podcast ad? Let's find out. I'm Adam from JudoScale, and at JudoScale, there's no marketing team, no salespeople, and no customer support. I mean, we do have customer support, but it's just us, the developers. That's why our support is top-notch. Anyway, we're JudoScale. We're the autoscaler that actually works. We do it better than anyone else by tracking the right metrics and checking those metrics more frequently. And we wrap it all in a beautiful UI with powerful and intuitive controls. We work with hosting platforms like Heroku, Render, and Amazon ECS to gracefully handle your traffic spikes and backed up job queues. If you want that peace of mind and a much lower hosting bill, you should check us out. Visit judoscale.com/remote Ruby for your special gift as a remote Ruby listener. That's judoscale.com/remote Ruby.
I feel like these days, a lot of my workflow, as you progress in your career, like you start out and you're reading a lot of the docs, but once you get to a certain level of complexity, you're like, if I'm going to integrate this feature into Active Record, I actually need to understand a bit of how this works internally in Active Record. So like I find over the last few years, just spending way more time reading like the Rails source code in order to implement something, so that I have that same knowledge of like, this is how it works today. It's likely that this way of implementing something is going to be the most stable for the long term, as opposed to monkey patching something. This is another way of giving you more of that context so that you have more of that knowledge of like, here's the way to hook into Rails properly to add this extra feature or something. Because yes, the docs can be helpful, but the docs don't often explain everything that's possible. And you really need that extra depth to really understand, like, okay, this is how we could do it. Like, according to the docs, here's a suggestion, but that's not really a good way for this specific thing. That's what we're working towards with these kind of tools, is like giving that really deep context there that previously was kind of only you reading the source code for Rails or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The other thing I like to say is that it's exactly what you're saying. Like, we as humans, we developers, we use everything available. We use documentation, we read the source code, we use the REPL, right? So a lot of the discovery that we are doing is just using the REPL, right? I type my class name, press dot, hit tab, and I see what shows and what comes up. And the point is exactly that. Like, we need to give coding agents all those tools. We need to give access to documentation, because so far, most of them, they only have access to the source. But no, give access to the documentation as it's in disk. Give access to the runtime. It needs to have a REPL, right? Like, our lives would be much worse without a REPL. So we are making the agent life also worse by not giving it a REPL. So we want to give it a REPL and have it have the ability to try out stuff. And then there are other things. People who are into like coding agents, they will set up all those MCPs. Oh, an MCP to talk to the database, an MCP to talk to this queue system. They're like, an MCP to talk to Redis. And they're like, why? Like, your app already knows how to talk to the database. It already knows how to talk to Redis. Just use the code in your app to do that. So yeah, it's really about making all those things available for developers and coding agents alike.
I think when I was watching the video, the coolest part to me was the collaborative browser testing, where it implemented the feature and then it went back and tested it. I was like, that's something I have not seen anyone really doing. I was curious how you kind of came up with that workflow.
I don't remember exactly the origin story here. We have a bunch of features, so we can talk a little bit about this. So there is one aspect of this that is not new, but there are several aspects of what we are doing that is new here. So today, some people, they are using Playwright MCP to do automated UI testing. But the issue with that, as I like to say, is that imagine that you are implementing a feature, which is, so let's continue with the project manager. And then you want to transfer projects between organizations, between two organizations. So imagine you have to implement this feature. What you usually do, again, like you go to the browser and you have to be an admin of those organizations in order to do that. So you have to go to the browser, you create your account, make sure an admin, create two organizations, make sure, create a project. So there's like a lot of setup that you have to do. And then if you're using Playwright for testing, it starts with an empty environment. So the first thing that it has to do in order to test this, yeah, it has to like go and create an account. And then sometimes like Playwright cannot, maybe you're using magic links for authentication and then Playwright cannot figure it out. Then we start adding some special endpoints for Playwright to go into, and then it has to go create the organizations. It usually spends so much time doing that, getting stuck that it doesn't finish the thing. It's just not effective. And then the benefit with running it in the browser is that it is the session that you're using, right? So as you said, like it's collaborative. The browser session I'm using to build the feature, validated that it works, it also used for testing. And so that part is new, but I can't remember. It may be one of the things that was there since the beginning. Like when we were thinking about doing this, we kind of knew some of the things that we wanted to do. And two of them, they are there right now. So one is the inspector. We want to inspect and click. And we did the integration with the web framework and template language. So you know this element goes to the template. And I think the browser testing was the other one that we wanted to have since the beginning. There are two things that we kind of mapped We haven't implemented them, but I'm going to talk about them because people maybe will listen and they're like, I really want that. And then they'll let us know and then we can prioritize it. But the other one is we want to do like built-in accessibility testing. So we want you to be able like to click a button. We do the accessibility testing and we start fixing it because we have everything. We have the browser. So that's one of the things that I think being in the browser allows us to do. And the other one is automated testing in the sense that I should be able to like start recording. So Playwright already has this. I should be able like to start recording as I click navigate through the page and say, hey, write a test for this. But the thing is that Playwright usually uses that to write a Playwright test. And in here, because we have the LLM, right, we can record the session and then I can say, hey, write an integration test using Capybara. Are we still using Capybara in Rails? Is that?
We are. Yeah. Yeah, we are.
Fantastic.
I'm using Playwright instead of Selenium, but yeah, still using Capybara at the end of the day.
Yeah, so, like we can do all of those things. So it's really nice to be in this place where you think like, wow, now I am in the browser and I am doing things tailored to each web framework. So what can we do? What are the things that we can build? So those are, I think, like the 4 ones that we had since the beginning. Inspector, the browser testing, the recording session for testing and accessibility. And I'm sure more are going to come up because we just started exploring the design space, really.
When your app breaks in production, you want to quickly understand and fix it, not sift through the logs for the next hour. That's where Honeybadger comes in. Honeybadger notifies you of errors, outages, and performance issues as they occur and helps you respond instantly when your systems go down. When you need to dig deeper, Honeybadger's advanced query engine helps you reach into your logs and grab just the information you need. With error tracking, performance and uptime monitoring, log management, and support for over 10 languages, Honeybadger is the best tool to gain real-time insights into your application's health and performance. Best of all, it's free to get started and setup takes less than 5 minutes. Be sure to bookmark honeybadger.io. That's www.honeybadger.io. The accessibility stuff's really exciting because, like, I feel like a lot of the Rails developers that I know have much more comfortableness, or whatever the word is, for doing back-end work, and their front-end skills are enough to get by. We like use Hotwire and Stimulus and Turbo and build just enough, but we don't know all the ins and outs of accessibility. That's definitely a tough one. And having anything to make that easier, I think, is very welcome. And along those lines, I was curious, do you have any plans to do, because Rails ships with the front-end framework now, and you're running in the browser, that's something that probably you can do more stuff with than just something that's able to read your JavaScript files. Like, you actually can interact with Stimulus or Turbo and fire events in the browser using Tidewave, which is cool. So like potentially there's some great ways of maybe just for testing, even being able to like, here, this is how you need to fire events to generate tests for a Stimulus controller that's doing autocomplete or whatever. Like, it feels like there's a lot that just being in the browser, all the front end stuff, which I feel like a lot of people in Rails struggle with understanding how does Hotwire work. This will be very helpful for that. I'm just curious if you have plans to do deeper integration with stuff on the front end.
Generally speaking, so for example, when it comes to live view on the Phoenix side as well, right? And then Hotwire, is that the models already know that, and we don't really have to do much about it, except mapping templates, right? Saying like, oh, when you did this thing, because what the browser is seeing and the agent is seeing, again, like the agent can look at the code and it can look at the HTML. But if we can do the connection and say, look, that HTML came from this code. So that's what we do. And then when it comes like to writing it itself, it already can do so like naturally. when it comes to testing it, it also does so naturally because the way it tests is by using the JavaScript API for dispatching events. It's not going to stimulus per se. It will know that it can do that if it wants, and it can invoke something in particular. It knows that, but for a lot of those things, it can stay a little bit higher level. I think the other place, which I don't think applies to stimulus, because stimulus, it's like controllers in the sense that it is going and working on the DOM and modifying the DOM, but it's not really taking care of rendering the DOM like React, correct?
Most times. I mean, sometimes you might use the stimulus controller to integrate a JavaScript calendar. And so you might have a wrapper around a third-party library. That might generate more HTML client side, but generally stimulus is kind of operating on the HTML that already got sent over by the browser. But a lot of cases, if you're grabbing a library, those might be generating HTML though, dynamically.
Yeah, so in this case, the model, it knows JavaScript really well, and it's going to figure out. So our job is to close the gap. So for example, thinking about front-end integration, supporting React is something, it's in our next milestone, because you can see how React in certain ways is like Action View, because it's this whole framework that takes all the control of the rendering. And then you have components spread over multiple files. And then you need to know how things map. So long story short is those are definitely things that we want to do. And we are already doing some of it at the template level. I think for stimulus, because it's something much simpler, or like live view hooks, for example, it's mostly JavaScript. It already does a reasonable job. And for the big frameworks like React, we have to come as well and do very specific integration. So we are doing that. And it's basically working case by case, understand it and see, oh, where are the potential gaps, right? Working with applications, asking it to do changes and see where it struggles, where it cannot find files properly, right? Like whenever you ask it to do a change, and then it's like start grabbing and listing all the files, you're like, is that we are probably not feeding enough information, and then we find ways to close those loops.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's probably welcome news, because I know, like, Andrew, you guys use React on stuff on the front end, right?
Yeah, in one specific spot.
Yeah.
I actually have the stimulus controller that mounts React components.
Yeah. And I was also going to say, like, the inertia community in Rails has been growing quite a lot too. And so that'll be awesome for them, especially because they're using React or Vue, or I can't remember, it also supports Svelte, I think. That'll be awesome as well, where it's like the location of those components and stuff will be specific to how inertia wants them defined in Rails. And you'll be able to detect that and give them access directly to those things, and also be able to introspect in Rails that, like, the render inertia custom render that the gem adds, here's how it works. We have the docs, we have all the source code for the gem, can access all that, and really should make development with that stuff way, way more easy because it'll already have that context. That's cool. I'm excited for that.
One thing we've been talking about, like, it has access to the HTML, it has access to your code, it has access to the logs, and it can dive deeper into the gem docs and things like that because they're all in the system. How does it maintain all that context though without, because that's a lot. I even struggle to like keep all that stuff in my head when I'm like doing it by myself. So how does it maintain that level of context?
So the beautiful thing about Rails and Phoenix is that being frameworks that are well used and that our batteries included, a lot of it's already there. It doesn't need to ask docs to figure how to do something. Then if it's using a package that is not that well known, it will have to do that. And as it's working on the things that it's building, it's just being proactive about it, right? So it's like, oh, okay, I'm reading this. Oh, I can see that this is called the documentation for this. Or we don't have support for web fetch yet, but that's what we would see your editor or your CLI do, right? It's going to search on Google. A lot of those things, when it's working, it's getting the information as it needs. There is a whole separate discussion, which is for large projects. And as your project grows, how do you maintain context between features? Why does this thing exist? What are the business requirements? That's a big kind of unsolved area that we can talk about as well, right? But when you mentioned the word context and keeping context, it came to mind. So it's something that it is currently unsolved, right? But on the day-to-day, using the tools, it is going for things. We know it's not deterministic, right? So sometimes it's going to go into a way that is not good. It's going to read docs that do not help, or is going to ask for logs and nothing useful is going to be there. But overall, it can, in my experience, it's doing a good job. I'm not into the mindset of people that are like, oh, all developers are only going to be reviewing code. I don't see how that can become a reality. But for me, it definitely makes me more productive. Using Tidewave and using other coding agents is definitely saving me time across different tasks.
Yeah, we had this discussion at work the other day. Someone was like, these AI tools are great for like a greenfield project because it doesn't have all that level of business knowledge like attached to it. But for an app like ours, which has been going on for a few years, and it's got different domains, it's got different module systems. Like we have a customer side, we have a CMS side, we have an admin, all these things. We find it very difficult to use it because it doesn't have all that context, right? Because it doesn't know like, oh, well, when I'm looking at this file, I need to know that I'm in the CMS and like I need to be using these things. And when I'm in the customer side, I'm using these things. So if you have more to say about those larger applications and getting use out of tools like these, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So the way I like to think about it is that we have those large code bases, right? So you can think it's a graph where you have different files connected. And when you want to implement a feature, there is usually an entry point, but this graph is large and you don't know what is the entry point. You don't know where you should start, right? And one of the ways where you can start with implementing the feature is saying, look, I want you to implement the feature in this file. And that basically means you're choosing one of the places in this graph. So it's like going back to giving it a little bit more direction. And now it's like, okay, so it knows that's the starting point. And then it's going to find files or modules or things or classes that it calls from there, right? And start building the context that it needs. So that's kind of the tools that we have right now to shorten the context. Sometimes there's like semantic search, there is grep. And what I hear from most people is that it's basically not good enough for the large projects as well. And then what Tidewave does is that it introduces another entry point in that, again, it's the graph. And then if we start for the UI, we are basically saying, you start from this controller. And then from there, build your context to do it. So that's why I say it's an unsolved problem. We are trying to find ways to improve this. But for me, the problem is a little bit deeper because a lot of the times this context is just not there in the code base. When something changes, imagine implement a feature and it breaks a test when you implement a new feature. What is wrong? Is it the implementation or is it the test? And usually we know because we have been working on this app for 3 years. We have all the business context. But if it was a junior developer as well, they may not know. They'll have to ask, or they will make the wrong assumption and we'll have to catch it during the code review. And they'll say, we should not do that. This was important because of this and this. It's not only about it also happens in open source libraries as well, right? Like somebody does a change, they say, no, we can actually not do this. This is important. So I feel like a lot of the issues with large projects is because there is the context, and the context is not in the code base. It may be somewhere. Maybe we have like a wiki where we keep this sort of information, but it's most likely out of date anyway. And to me, I feel like that's why it's such a hard problem to solve, because it's a problem that exists that we have not been trying to solve it. And now we are kind of amplifying it because we are bringing those tools, somebody new to the project that doesn't have the context, and they are stuck on those decisions. So one of the exciting things about AI, again, like I don't believe that we are going to be only reviewing code in 2 years or something like that. But I think that it can change enough of our development workflow for us to start asking some assumptions, some things that we took for granted, right? Or some things about our workflow that we took for granted, right? So for example, we have been saying, well, we don't really write requirements. We don't really write design decisions. And maybe we should reassess that. And the issue that I see is that a lot of people, they want to use AI to solve this problem, which feels backwards to me, right? Because they say, oh, we're going to have AI write the requirements. But now that's the document. And how do you make sure that the document is going to be kept up to date? So we are thinking like, well, we need to write requirements. We're going to ask AI to do it. But now it's more document, it's more things for us to review alongside the code and the test. So how we are going to solve this? And then I'm like, well, maybe it's Cucumber. I'm not saying it is Cucumber, but that's the kind of questions that come to my mind. It's like, well, we tried Cucumber a decade ago, more than a decade ago. Most people that I talked to, they actually started with really good intentions, but came out burned out from using the tool because allegedly a business person was going to write the Cucumber files, but they never wrote it. And then the developers, they were the one writing the files, and they were writing a bunch of regular expressions to match on these steps. Like there was a lot of overhead for no benefit. But maybe if you're like, well, you know what? Maybe I'll write those files now, use it some sort of requirement guidance for the AI, because the AI is going to be the one implementing it. So maybe that's what we should do. And I don't think Cucumber, I'm not sure. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I hope it makes sense what I'm saying, right? Like, I think it's worthy to kind of go back and start reevaluating our tools and workflows and our development process to see how can we solve those new problems. Because yeah, it's largely unsolved. We did minor dents into improving the situation only.
One idea that we were talking about at work was basically putting README files in folders for a group of components, for example, putting like a README file in that folder. And I was very against it because I was like, that's just documentation. That's just going to be out of date. And now the AI has like this out of date documentation. It's just going to make it worse because we all know that documentation has a fast decay rate. So it is interesting to think about Cucumber again, though, in 2025. You're like, maybe now it might have a place.
That's really interesting because it's been, I don't know how many years since I last used Cucumber. And my memory of it was those regex matches being like really annoying. And I was like, why don't we just write actual normal tests? And yet, over those years of building applications, I think about how many times a support ticket comes in, you change something, and you look at the code and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Why did we do it that way? Let me go fix it to also fix this customer's issue. And then you deploy it, and then somebody else writes in with the issue that you just broke something that technically the code was doing, but didn't call out explicitly. And it feels like that's what is really missing. Those Cucumber tests were kind of trying to pull out the why, because your code is the how something should be done. It's not necessarily the why. And that's really missing in a lot of places in our code bases, I feel like.
We don't have like the source of truth as well. Like theoretically, the code is meant to be the source of truth, but there are bugs and there are like things that are bugs and we cannot fix them because now people are relying on those bugs. So the bugs become features, right? But we don't document it anywhere. And we are generally horrible at writing tests. We don't give good test names. Sometimes the tests, they are just not good. They are too focused on the implementation rather than how we're expecting the feature to work. So it's no surprise that everybody's confused about, well, should I change the code or should I change the test? But it goes back to what Andrew was saying as well. I don't want to write documentation if documentation is going to go out of date. So I want to have some sort of guarantee. And that's where Cucumber comes. Like, well, it is documentation, but it's executable documentation. So we can kind of assert, we can kind of have some guarantee. It's not fully guaranteed, but we can have a little bit more guarantee that it is actually being respected. What the Cucumber thing is saying is actually what is implemented. And I think it's also important, like one of the things that I think can be interesting about, again, I'm not saying the answer is Cucumber, right? But when thinking about those things is that you can have like explicit modes. You can say, look, AI, before you implement this feature, you need to or write new Cucumber files. So we agree before you implement it. Or if you have to change an existing one, you do it. You try to do it up front. Of course, you may find changes later. That's part of development, right? The development cycle, but you have to do up front. And then you kind of say, look, you are not allowed to change those files without me approving it. That's the important thing, because that's the thing that we can kind of take as source of truth. And those are the things that we can kind of review. And then that's going to give a foundation for the agent to say, oh, okay, I see that this Cucumber file broke, so I should not go, because they're just going to guess. They're just going to say, oh, certainly is the implementation, right? So they'll be like, oh, it broke this thing. And I should probably ask, how should we progress? Do you want to change this in this particular way? Or do you want me to change the specification? Or do you want me to change the other things? So those are the things that I think about. And I think it can be very interesting to explore now. I don't know if you saw, like, there's also this editor from Amazon that is exploring like this design space as well. They are like Bear, Claude, or things. So there are people exploring this. But I am generally skeptical with the solutions like, let's just write more documentation and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, to quote an old developer I used to work with, the code is documentation, right?
It's definitely something that maintaining gems and open source stuff is like inevitably the docs are out of date and it just happens. It's so hard. One other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about this, there's so much context in the Git history that would be valuable that you could probably pull out some of those things by looking at this change was made 8 years ago and why was that made? Hopefully the commit message explains why, but maybe not. We're all humans and get lazy with some of those commit messages.
Yeah. And I feel seen because one of the things that I am horrible at is writing good commit messages. It's a character flaw.
Yeah.
Especially now that I use AI to write them. So like they're just getting worse.
Yeah, it's so hard because like ideally you want to be descriptive about it, but you're like, well, that didn't work. So I had to go fix this and whatever. And like at the end of the day, what you really want is like even the pull request description starts out good in a direction. Then people discuss, you implement it. The solution ends up being totally different. And so like you can't even use that as context necessarily. There's something that gets lost in the process of here's the intention, here's the solution. And the only thing you end up actually documenting is the code has the actual like, here's the rules that we implemented and decided on. But there's no moment of like, well, let's recap and summarize before we merge this pull request. You kind of do. But at that point, you're like tired and ready to get this into the code base. And I think there's just the tendency to just like, all right, squash all the commits. Let's give it the highlights and that's about it. But you don't end up as part of the flow, actually documenting like the business requirements or like why this change was made and what its purpose is or whatever. Like that feels like it still gets lost pretty easily.
And I think, in fairness, I should also say that maybe there is no answer, right? Because in here, we talked about code potentially being the answer to help us do this, but we know it isn't. We talked about tests. We talked about documentation. We talked about potentially being Git. We are bringing so many different things like, oh, maybe the answer should be there. And it's not in any of those things, or not fully. That maybe now we try to experiment, build all those different tools to try to improve this. And then maybe at the end of it, it's like, well, I guess that's our job after all. I guess our job is to be the people who has the whole context, that talks to the product owner, that talks to QA, that and assess everything and make those decisions, right? So yeah, but I think for me, it's exciting, right? Like for somebody who works on programming languages, web frameworks, I have been doing developer tooling for more than 15 years at this point. It does open up the problem space and how we can solve and talk about those things. That is definitely exciting to me.
Really interesting how much has changed now as a profession. One of the questions that always comes up that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is like, if you were learning to code today, what would you do? How do you prevent yourself from like only learning it? Because somebody told me the term like expert beginner. You know how to like copy paste the devise, install commands and whatever, but you don't ever get into the weeds enough. And it's always a struggle to like get into, I need to modify devise. I can't do it because I don't understand the code. Is that something you worry about for beginners where like they might have less ability to get into the weeds? It's too easy to just go say, hey, ask the AI to do something. It's kind of like when I remember being in school where you're like, I don't want to stop and go learn assembly right now because I can't build anything that I can interact with. But it was helpful actually to learn a little bit of assembly to understand here's how the CPU works and RAM and accessing things and operating systems and just a little bit of the foundations. I feel like that's just probably forever a problem. And you have to force yourself a little bit to go understand how these things work behind the scenes. But I'm curious to hear your perspective on it because it feels like we're adding a big layer of abstraction onto programming.
Honestly, I don't know. Me personally, I think it was not going to be much different because the reason I got into open source is because I would install a gem and I would immediately read its source code. And I would not understand it, right? It's not like, oh, I understand everything that it's doing, right? But I would immediately read, add some like puts statements, right? Put string statements and just try to see what is happening there. And I got into open source because sometimes you would find a bug, I would find something that I could improve, and then I would submit a pull request. And that's how it started. And I like to think it's hard, right? But I like to think that that aspect would not change. And then how does that impact everybody in general? For me, it's very hard to say exactly because every person learns so differently, right? So I'm very impatient, right? Like I start reading a book. Most technical books that I start, I don't finish them because I start it and then they give me an idea and I will play with the idea and then I'm off the book. I usually don't come back. And I know that not everyone is like that, right? There are people who they're like, look, I actually have to understand the concept. Like, I like to say that me learning is like putting somebody in a dark room, right? And I just have to go and like kind of touch things and try to understand what is there rather than somebody who would go with the lantern, right? Like look at everything before making a decision. So I don't know how much as things change, as things evolve, how much of it is driven by character traits, right? How we each learn as a person. Another related example, like people ask me like, oh, what is the best way to learn Elixir? I am probably the worst person to ask that question. I learned it different than anybody else. And in terms of time, it has been so long ago, the oldest person to learn it, that I can barely remember how learning it is. And I feel about that in terms of programming, right? Well, has been quite some time that I was in that space where like, oh, I don't know anything, or I'm just starting. And how do you move forward from that?
I can relate because I worked at a job and they were like, we're going to make you write some elixirs. So they sent me 4 or 5 elixir books and I started reading one of them and I was like, okay, this is interesting. And so I put the book down, opened my computer, never opened the book again. So I can very much relate to that. Some people are just hands-on learners, and some people are much more methodical.
I feel like the nice part about this is with AI, you can, depending on how you learn, you can just ask it those questions along the way. And if you're worried about learning things deeply, like you just have to make sure that you're curious and ask it about that stuff. How does this work? And then it could just point you to the right file to go look at. Because that's always kind of been the hard part of learning. If you really, really want to get good with Rails, you really have to understand how Rails works inside. Most of your day job, there's no reason to go look at the internals of Rails. You're just like, I ran into an issue, something broke, I want to find the solution. And that's an opportunity to go dig deeper, but you don't actually have to. And so it's like, if you catch yourself in one of those moments, go do the extra digging. It may not solve your problem, but you will learn something. I like you read the stack trace. When it leaves your code base, go to the line of code where it's in Rails or whatever gem. Start there and then just poke around. I feel like that'll be hopefully something that beginners do, but I think everybody's kind of freaking out about no one's hiring juniors anymore. Like who's going to learn and whatever. So things are strange times.
I like that, by the way. I like that a lot. Go explore the first line of the stack trace that is not your app. I like that a lot. Yeah, it's a really good tip as well, right? Like you don't have to go all the way in, like just the first one.
Yeah.
Love it.
That's been helpful for me. And it's like you were saying earlier, like even if you don't understand it, who cares? It drops some nugget of knowledge in that you may think about later. And you'll read it maybe again in 6 months and then you'll actually understand it or something. So it's about planting those seeds.
Yeah. So to wrap up, I want to tell this story. I've told this a couple of times. It was the best class. This was like high school of my life. Okay. So it was like, I think not the last year, the before last year, before I went to university. So I had 2 years ahead of me. And then it was actually English classes. And it was first lesson of the year. So he entered the room and he started writing a bunch of text in the blackboard. English, writing in English, right? And I am Brazil. We are all speaking Portuguese. He starts writing in English. So he wrote the whole thing. And here's the thing that he did, and I did not know at the time, is that in the text, he put words that do not actually exist.
That's awesome.
So he wrote the thing, blah, 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 right? He wrote the whole thing. He finished it and he left. He's like, your job now is to understand the text and I'm going to come back later for a discussion. And he left the room and everybody immediately panicked, right? Because we started talking to each other. So I had my friend that she was really good at English. And I was like, what does that word mean? And then she was like, I don't know. Like you could see the panic on her face. She had like a private English school. She did not know what it meant. Like everybody was like, oh my God, we are not going to pass English this year. So he comes back. He was very nice. And then he's like, okay, now let's try. He didn't ask us what he means. He's just like, let's try to understand the text together. And then he went it. And then when he got into the unknown words, he said, oh, there's this word. I don't know what it means. So he would put like his arm over the word and say, but even without knowing what it means, I can kind of get the idea of what this is about. So this is about this. And then he would go, found another word. I don't know this one either, right? And then he said, actually, those words, they don't exist. But my point is that you don't have to know exactly how everything. And for me, it was like a phenomenal lesson because I think it applies to so many things, especially when reading code. When I started, I don't know everything, but you can guess a little bit around, try to understand, play, and debug. And eventually, at some point, you have the understanding of the whole. And so, very important for learning in general.
That is awesome. I love that story. Well, we won't keep you. We'll have a link to Tidewave in the show notes. Anything else you want to share before we head out?
No, I'm good. I have a wonderful time. Enjoy Tidewave, and hopefully we'll see each other much more frequently now.
Yeah, now that
So
you're
until
kind of
next
back
time.
in Rails.
Yeah, exactly.
Alrighty. Well, we'll catch you next week, Andrew.
Yes, sir. Thanks for coming on, Jose.
Yeah.
Thank you.